Hello, I'm Steve Whan. I'm CEO of the National Irrigators Council based in Canberra. National Irrigators Council is a peak lobby group for the irrigation sector, the infrastructure operators, peak commodity groups and also industry representative groups. We work in two key areas. First is obviously water and water policy, and the second is in the electricity area. So power prices are obviously a huge issue for those who are doing anything other than gravity feed, as I'm sure most of you would be very well aware. Today though, I've been asked to talk a bit about water policy, so I apologise for not being able to be there in person, but I hope that I'll be able to give you a bit of background about where we stand on some of these issues and the work that we've been doing with government. Water policy obviously has a lot of national areas and then a key focus on the basin plan as well. On the national areas, we have seen a very strong focus on some of these issues over the course of this year with the federal election and also with drought in many areas. And that's caused a lot of stress on the system. During the federal election, we saw some interesting policy announcements around continuing work on Northern Australia initiatives, which is very important to see the expansion of irrigation in Australia and continuing development of food and fibre, but there's a lot of work to go in that area. We also saw the government announce the National Water Grid, which is still yet to be formed, but which we would hope will bring together agencies and processes for ensuring that we plan better for the use of a very scarce resource. We have a National Water Initiative which forms the basis for many of the things that we've seen in the Basin Plan, and that applies right across Australia. So even though a lot of the focus at the moment is on the Murray-Darling Basin, we would expect to see things like pricing principles, the sort of philosophy about development of new schemes, metering policies, all rolling out in non-basin areas. So already we've seen that happening in New South Wales, in coastal rivers, and in Queensland, the Queensland government has flagged that its metering policy will extend across to non-Murray-Darling Basin areas. But I will focus mainly on the Murray-Darling Basin and some of the stresses particularly that are on at the moment because of the drought. We are seeing a situation where the drought has caused some severe stresses for everybody. Obviously people on general security have no general security water at the moment, but it's also putting a lot of pressure on river management. The lack of inflows in the northern basin means that the Murray has been running at very high levels for the last year. That is something which has caused an increase in losses, and those losses through water going over bank at areas like the Barmah Choke have been costing irrigators and the river as it tries to transfer water downstream. So the National Irrigators Council has been in quite close contact with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, who runs that aspect of the river, and in calling on ministers from the basin states to make sure that they have an equitable system of sharing of losses. It's something that has been a great concern to people around the Upper Murray particularly. We've also seen delivery issues in the system. So below the Barmah Choke on the Murray River, there are constraints on the capacity to deliver, and in these dry times we've seen those tested. We've seen a lot of development of more permanent plantings in the lower parts of the Murray, again often buying water on the allocation market, and we have put to government that they need to come up with a system to ensure that people who are buying allocation and own entitlement do that on the basis of knowing that they have their capacity for water when it is allocated to actually be delivered to them. And it's a complicated thing, but it's something government needs to deal with, and we're hoping that the Ministerial Council, which is meeting this Sunday, will start to look more carefully at that. Now this is an issue we first raised with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority early in 2018. At the time they said it wasn't an issue, but we now know that they and the governments have all recognised that it is a serious issue that needs to be dealt with. Drought obviously puts a lot of pressure on everybody, and it's sometimes hard to separate out issues from the Murray-Darling Basin Plan to water market impacts. The water market has been something that's been in place well before the Basin Plan, but obviously that becomes more stressed in a time where there is low allocations and when we've seen 1 in every 5 litres of water that used to be available for production return to the environment. All those things put pressure on a market, and we are seeing winners and losers in that water market. There is the market was designed first to ensure that water went to its highest value uses, and you'd probably have to say it's done that. We have seen water shifting into crops which are producing high value. We've actually seen the value of agricultural production increase quite substantially. But along the way that causes issues, and particularly when you are in a drought situation. If you have a thin market, we want to ensure that it's not capable of being manipulated, and we also want to ensure that it's transparent and that people can see what's going on. Particularly feel for people who have sold their permanent entitlement perhaps in previous droughts, and some were pushed by banks to do so, because they're now on an allocation market which is extremely expensive, and for crops which aren't enjoying great terms of trade, that makes life very difficult. So that water market is going to be the subject of an inquiry by the ACCC. We support that inquiry. In fact, we advocated for an inquiry, and we hope that they will be able to provide a bit more transparency about how the market works, a bit of information about whether it is capable of being manipulated, and have a look at whether it's fulfilling its original goals. Now I want to come now to the Basin Plan. Now that's obviously been the subject of a huge amount of public controversy, and with anything that is controversial, with anything that is such a subject of difference of opinion, it's always going to be difficult to come up with a plan which everyone agrees with. And you'd have to say that the Basin Plan, as it was set in 2012, didn't make either side happy. Irrigators on the one hand thought that it was taking away too much water, environmentalists thought that it wasn't taking enough. And I suppose when you look at it, that probably gives it its best chance of success. It's a plan that nobody particularly likes, but it's one which tried to form a compromise. Now I'm certainly aware that there is people and people in the irrigation sector who would rather the plan wasn't there. I guess my message to them, and as a person who spent most of my career in politics, including being New South Wales Agriculture Minister for a while, Shadow Minister for a few years, and now CEO of NIC, my message is that there isn't a practical alternative to the Basin Plan. I really do think that people who think that if the plan is either abolished or if there's a Royal Commission set up, that they'll see more water returned to irrigation, are living in a bit of a fantasy world. It's just not going to happen with the numbers that are or are likely to be in the future in the Commonwealth Parliament, who would have to approve any change to the plan. So that's why a lot of irrigator groups, including ours, say that we need to work to try and make the plan a success and to try and ensure that it doesn't have negative impacts on our industries. Now that's not easy. It's a real challenge. We have seen communities which have suffered when water has been purchased by the government. We have seen them lose population. We've also seen some that have done reasonably well as they've had efficiency programs and as they've been able to attract new businesses into the area. But we need to remember very clearly, and I think it's something that we don't see often in the media, that when we have seen a reduction of 20% in the water that is available to irrigation as a result of the buybacks and purchases for the environment. So when one area expands, when one farmer decides to take more water, it's being purchased off another. It's being purchased overall out of a smaller bucket, and that's really important for people to remember. Before going a bit more into what the challenges are with the Basin Plan, I just wanted to highlight some of the things which you mightn't see much of in terms of its successes and what it is actually doing for returning water to the environment. I mentioned that 1 in every 5 litres of water has been removed from production. And what that's done is it's meant that the environmental water holder owns more than 2,100 gigalitres, so 2,100 billion litres of water for the environment, which it's able to use for environmental watering events. And since that water was put in place, they've actually been able to supplement the river flows with environmental water, the equivalent of 18 Sydney harbours. So over 9,000 billion additional litres of water has been able to be released into the river, and we need to remember that that's on top of the base flows, on top of the flows which are already there and which are guaranteed and those flows of course take precedence over allocation of water to irrigators. So from an environmental point of view, the analysis has been showing that there is positive early environmental results. Now, you wouldn't know that by listening to a lot of the media that's out there and listening to some of the critics, but it does say to us that some of that work is producing results. Now, it's also important to remember that when the Basin Plan was introduced in 2007 or announced by John Howard, he made it absolutely clear that it was about increasing agricultural production using less water. It wasn't about wiping out irrigation. It wasn't about reducing or returning the system to its natural state. That's impossible. And it also wasn't about preventing drought. That's also not possible. So the plan itself is actually producing that sort of result. We have seen agricultural production increase, but that's not without negative impacts for some sectors. 2017-18 agricultural production figures showed that the gross value of irrigated agricultural production in Australia went from 15.5 billion the year before to 17.6 billion, and in the Murray-Darling Basin it went from 7.2 billion up to 8.6 billion. Now, as most of you would probably realise in the room, that's in part because we went into a dry year and we started to use the reserves of water which were actually put there for that specific purpose, to ensure that we could continue to produce food and fibre in a dry year. The figures showed that there was a similar picture in your sector, with fodder production having a higher proportion coming from irrigated production over that year. So that shows us the way that our system works to deliver water. It also highlights the fact that even with the Basin Plan, we are seeing some shifting around. We are seeing some increase in production, but it really serves to emphasise the value of that production to the communities right across the basin and to Australia overall. We've got some significant challenges with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan though, and even though the water recovery task has been largely complete, in fact in the southern basin there is no further water recovery required at this stage. However, we have two really key components of the plan which do need to be implemented. That's the 605 gigalitres worth of supply measures and the 450 gigalitres worth of so-called upwater. Now, the 605 gigalitres worth of supply measures are the real difficult point at the moment, because if they are not implemented, then we could see government having to go back and recover that water, the gap, from irrigators. Now, that's in 2024, and at this stage you'd have to say that those supply projects are way behind where they should have been. National Irrigators Council, along with many others, has been calling on government to get on with the job of delivering those projects. So they include things like the Menindee reconfiguration, constraints removal, a range of other projects to deliver water, for instance, to endangered wetlands and so on. But we can't just sit back and say, well, you know, if they fall over, that's government's fault, because unfortunately the cost of that will fall on our sector. So that's why we've continued to emphasise for government and for particularly the state ministers that they have to get on with that job, and that we are willing to engage with them to try and help wherever possible. Now, the second component that is a big issue for all of our communities is the 450 gigalitres worth of so-called upwater. This is water that's to be recovered through efficiency measures, and it's meant to produce further environmental benefits, mainly in South Australia. Now, at the moment, the Basin Plan indicates that if that water is not recovered, that it can't be obtained through buyback. I guess my concern and my warning on this is that unless we see a really strong effort made towards that, we may see a future government that revisits that. And in my view, that's important for states to actually ensure that they are engaging and trying to find projects which have no negative impacts on communities, but which do deliver some of that water. So from the National Irrigators Council point of view, we want to engage with the remainder of the Basin Plan to try and ensure that it is put in place so that when we get to 2024 and to the basin plan being finally implemented, we don't see a push for more water to be recovered from irrigators. Instead, we can lobby for and focus on a push to ensure that the water that has been recovered for the environment is used properly. And when I say that, I mean by ensuring that we we recognise that fixing the environment of a river is not just about putting more water down it. It's also about ensuring that we have a range of complementary measures in place. So the water is the right temperature for native fish to breed, that we're looking at feral pest species, that we're looking at connectivity to ensure that fish can move around the system and so on. A whole range of measures which we've seen outlined for the Northern Basin, they're called the toolkit measures in the Northern Basin, but which also need to be a part of the picture for the Southern Basin. So those are the things which we'd like to see focused on in the post-2024 period when the basin plan is theoretically implemented. And as industries who use irrigation and the irrigation sector overall, we want to see a strong focus over the next few years on fixing the rest of the problems of the basin plan, making sure that it is finally implemented in a way which does not penalise our communities further and our industries, and then moving on to see how we can ensure that environmental water is used most effectively. It's a big job. There's a lot of work to do, but I look forward to our industry working positively to try and achieve those things, and I thank you for your time today.